Welcome all to NAPC's May webinar, Engaging Local Decision Makers to Support Historic Preservation. I'm Brianna Paxton. I'm a revitalization policy analyst with Preservation Maryland, but I live in Savannah, Georgia, and I'm a former board member for the National Alliance Preservation Commissions. And I'll be speaking a little bit today as well as moderating. Today's webinar is presented with generous support from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and we wanted to make sure you all got the invite to their upcoming Past Forward conference in Milwaukee in September 16th through 18th, 2025. I'll be there, so I hope to see as many of you there that can make it. I now need to take a few minutes to get everyone oriented to this webinar platform. This big marker platform we love, but it's a little different than Zoom or Teams or some of the other platforms out there. So you have a Q&A, a chat, and a polling function, which are all tabs at the top right of your screen. And you can click to minimize them and see more options. And if you want to bring them back up, there is a blue chat button at the bottom right corner. So click that to bring the chat back up. If you want to view today's presentations in full screen mode, just hover over the little presentation and click the full button that comes up. And if you experience any technical issues, use the private chat function to send a message to Marie Snyder with National Alliance Preservation Commissions. She's the magician behind the scenes here, making all of the clicks happen for us. This session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing. And as a registrant, you will receive automatically the recording in just a few hours after the session is completed. Few other housekeeping issues. Continuing education credits are listed on this opening slide, and you can also find these instructions repeated throughout the presentation in the chat tab. As you're listening to the presentations, we invite you to ask questions throughout the webinar. And I, as moderator, try my best to make sure we address all those questions, as well as those of you that submitted questions ahead of time. And if you like a question, please give it a thumbs up to upvote it. And that will let us know that that's a question folks are really wanting to hear an answer to. And we'll try to get to those ones first. The National Alliance Preservation Commissions is committed to providing a welcoming space for our webinars that encourages collaboration, discussion, and the sharing of ideas and points of view. So note, by attending this webinar, you agree to follow our code of conduct, which is listed on the screen below. And now I would like to introduce you to today's presenters. I'm joined alongside Chris Cody with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and Lisa Craig, who has worn many hats throughout the year. I'm not going to try to do a big introduction for them, as they both have had a long career in preservation and have lots to share with you this afternoon. So let's turn it over now to Chris for him to kick us off.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Bree. My name is Chris Cody. I'm Associate General Counsel at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where I work in the area of legal advocacy. And prior to coming to the National Trust, I was the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer for the state of Arizona. And before that, I worked at Historic Charleston Foundation in Charleston, South Carolina, as their Director of Advocacy and Manager of Advocacy and Staff Attorney. And in that capacity, I had a lot of experience with local historic preservation advocacy. So you might see some examples from my days in Charleston in the slideshow. So the images that you see on this opening slide are all from cases that the National Trust Legal Advocacy Team has been involved in over the last year, where our local advocacy partners played absolutely critical roles. And when the National Trust contemplates becoming involved in a preservation issue, having strong local advocates that we can partner with is one of our key considerations. Just because we found that our engagement's most productive when it's part of a coalition supporting local voices. So just another way that local preservation advocacy is so important. Now, really, local historic preservation advocacy, in my mind, is the most important type of historic preservation advocacy. The vast majority, and I mean like 99% of Americans' interactions with historic preservation occurs in local settings. local historic preservation issues, local historic preservation boards and commissions. They are the overwhelming substance of the historic preservation movement in America. And because of this, local preservation has shaped the public perception of historic preservation more than anyone else. When the New York Times runs an article about historic preservation, it's typically not about things like the latest program comment from the President's Advisory Council on Historic Preservation or the latest statement about climate change resilience from the National Trust. It's about specific local issues, resources that are under threat, or locally based trends like the adoption of solar panels in historic neighborhoods. And I've heard from federal preservation officers and congressional staff who reference and cite local preservation issues and trends during meetings about national level policies. So truly, local historic preservation issues are what shape the perceptions of historic preservation, even for federal decision makers in Washington, D.C. Local preservation advocacy is also critically important because preservation is different everywhere, and no two historic communities are alike. Every community's historic preservation policies and advocacy should be tailored to that specific community's needs and desires, and it should also reflect the unique significance of their built environments. But preservation is not one size fits all, and for it to be effective, it absolutely requires local knowledge, input, and advocacy. It's important also to understand the limitations of federal and state preservation laws and advocacy when compared to the power of local preservation laws and advocacy. So there are a very limited number of organizations that are either successful statewide historic preservation organizations or organizations that have a nationwide focus on preservation advocacy. When you compare that very limited number with over 3,500 local historic preservation ordinances, which is a number that was recently published in a paper by Sarah Bronin. I've heard numbers as low as 2,300, 3,500 is the new high. No matter what the number is, we're talking about thousands of ordinances out there and thousands of commission members. There are also currently 115 members of the National Preservation Partners Network, which is a fantastic organization for historic preservation nonprofits. It's really a very powerful advocacy network. And when you compare the weight of thousands of local ordinances and commission members and hundreds of local nonprofits out there to the very small number of folks that are doing preservation advocacy at the statewide or nationwide level, really the weight of what preservation is in this country and how it works is overwhelmingly on the local side. It's also important to understand the difference in the laws. Most federal and state historic preservation laws, like Section 106 or State Historic Preservation Acts, they only require agencies to go through processes. There's no ultimate decision-making authority. The best that can happen is avoidance, minimization, or mitigation of adverse effects to historic resources, and the ultimate option for SHPOs in the ACHP is termination of consultation. That's not the same as local preservation laws that directly empower decision makers with very clear authorities to make decisions. So let's look at some of those authorities that local preservation groups have. One of the most common is issuing certificates of appropriateness. This is a huge power that gives communities design review authority over new constructions and additions in historic districts. And the ability to deny a certificate of appropriateness, it's a huge decision that rests in the hands of local bodies. Ditto for demolition stays and denials. There's a lot of variation in how communities approach this across the country. Some places you can issue a pause for 30 days, 90 days, sometimes a year on a demolition. In other communities, outright denials are possible. Again, the applicant usually, if they're denied, has the opportunity to come back with a new application after a certain amount of time. But this is a huge power to actually be able to say, no, you're not going to tear this building down when you want to. And something that's a lot stronger, in my view, than the procedural review processes prescribed in federal and state law. So it's also important to understand that a lot of the power in local zoning laws comes from the fact that usually they are zoning laws. They come from zoning overlays. And zoning law is a very well-developed area of law in our country. Now, on the slide, you'll see that there's a question mark, zoning or not zoning. That's because there are a number of jurisdictions where local historic preservation ordinances are not considered to be zoning ordinances. And the National Trust has actually argued this both ways, depending on what's most beneficial for historic preservation in the particular jurisdiction in question. But in general, usually the authority for local commissions to have true decision-making power comes from the fact that these ordinances are zoning laws. So I said ordinances. I think that's the next thing that's important to understand is the difference between ordinances and guidelines. Ordinances are codified in city code, but they often have to reference guidelines that are included typically as appendixes. And really, this is something that's evolved in recent years in historic preservation law. When I think about local historic preservation ordinances, I generally divide them into generations. There's still far too many out there that are generation one ordinances, really broad, non-specific language, sometimes as short as one sentence that says things like just ensure compatibility. These are highly subject to legal challenge. You'd be surprised how many major cities still have ordinances that look like this. Generation two is far better, detailed written guidelines, references to specific local contexts. These ordinances really are good efforts, but they're not as good as the current best practice. Generation three ordinances, the modern best practice, has just really voluminous information for the public, references to local context, photos of building styles, things that are desirable in communities, minimal vague language, and lots of tools to help the public. So public service announcement, if there's anyone on this call whose community is still using one of these older ordinances that doesn't have all those things, it's time to update them before a legal challenge forces you to. So all of those ordinances and guidelines pertain to historic preservation commissions, but that's not the only venue for local historic preservation advocacy. And one of the key things that I want y'all to understand from this webinar is the importance of engaging in historic preservation advocacy in venues beyond just your local commissions, because decisions get made a lot of other places. So for example, let's take a look really fast at the land use entitlement governance structure for Charleston, South Carolina. So in Charleston, there's the city council with 12 districts plus the mayor, and most of these lower bodies just issue recommendations to the city council. So advocating for historic preservation at your city council is incredibly important because they hold ultimate decision-making power in a lot of these cases. Another very important body is the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission handles rezoning and ordinance changes most often, and this can be a rezoning that expands a historic district overlay and expands your historic district and protects new properties. An ordinance change could be changing your ordinance from an older generation 2 to a new generation 3 ordinance. All of these things that are very much historic preservation concerns happen at the Planning Commission, so it's a very important venue for historic preservation advocacy. The Board of Zoning Appeals in Charleston is the only one of these boards on the screen that their decisions do not go to city council as recommendations, rather they're appealed directly to court. The Board of Zoning Appeals issues special exceptions and variances. So variances from underlying zoning and also special exceptions. Special exceptions in Charleston includes a number of tests for specific uses. Like hotels in Charleston, the proliferation of hotels became a concern, so a special exception test was adopted that now any new hotel in certain areas of the downtown have to go through this special exception test to be granted it. So again, another very important venue for historic preservation advocacy. The next board on this list, the Board of Architectural Review, is Charleston's Design Review Commission, Historic Review Board. It's called a lot of things in a lot of places. In Charleston, it's called the Board of Architectural Review. And there are two, one that deals with small projects and one that deals with large projects. Obviously an important venue for local historic preservation advocacy. And then the last two, the Design Review Board deals with design everywhere outside of the historic district that's not covered by the Board of Architectural Review. And the Technical Review Committee does site plan reviews. And both of these are still really important venues for historic preservation advocacy. Things outside of the historic district are still important considerations for the quality of life of historic district residents and the overall health of historic communities. So just because a project isn't within your historic district doesn't mean that you shouldn't still be caring about it having good design and contributing to your community. And with site plan review, I mean, this deals with things like water, traffic, all sorts of considerations that, again, can affect your historic district and historic resources and they're important places to go and advocate. So one other thing that the Planning Commission does that I really think is incredibly important to highlight is the general or comprehensive or master plan updates for communities. So many states have a requirement that says that every 5 or 8 years, your town or city or county is required to update their master plan. Now, every community across the country, as far as I know, is required to have one by law under state planning acts. And when the time comes to update these planning documents, it's absolutely critical for historic preservation advocates to be involved. These documents speak not just to raw planning, but also to the values of communities, to community priorities. And historic preservation needs to be highlighted and woven into these plans really in a very holistic way for every kind of historic community. And a lot of people don't understand the impact that planning and these decisions can really have on historic districts, on communities. So when you think about things like setbacks or density or lot coverage, these are all generally dictated by zoning, and that zoning is established in these master or comprehensive plans. And to illustrate how important things like zoning and density, setbacks, everything I just mentioned is to the health of historic communities, I'm going to share with you some really interesting drawings done by a brilliant architecture firm in Charleston, Liberatos Architects, Bevan and Liberatos, that I think underscore what the difference between good and bad planning can do. So this here is an example of what's becoming a far too common form of construction, multifamily construction, 4 to 5 stories hiding a parking deck. They're all over our country, everywhere. And this is a reimagining of that design with the same number of housing units, the same square footage of retail, but done in a different kind of fabric, a single family, more historic fabric to achieve the same use. Really, all that's lost is the cars. What you see on the left is what happens when cities are designed for people and for the community, as opposed to for developers and for automobiles. And when dealing with new construction adjacent to or within historic districts, having the proper planning scheme to ensure that you get something at least closer to what you see on the left versus the right is incredibly important. And when you take differences like this and aggregate them over large areas, it's really striking. I mean, this is an area of Charleston that was developed, as you see on the left, with really a modern development plan. And on the right, you see the Liberatos' brilliant reimagining of it as something that looks a lot more like the rest of Charleston and the historic districts, and looks more like a livable, walkable, urban historic community. The way that you accomplish what's on the right versus what's on the left is through planning. It's getting the right things into your comprehensive plan, your master plan, general plan, whatever it's called, and then ensuring that your zoning drives the kind of development that's appropriate and compatible with your historic districts. So, again, a lot of people, when they think about local historic preservation advocacy, just think about going to their local Board of Architecture review, historic district board of review, and advocating there. Don't tear things down, make sure additions are appropriate. But real effective historic preservation advocacy at the local level goes far beyond that. It involves these planning issues. It involves getting to your city council members at the highest level of decision making, and understand that this local historic preservation advocacy is the most important part of the whole preservation movement. This is where we are defined as a movement by how things go and how local preservationists approach these challenges. So, I strongly encourage everyone to think broadly about opportunities and venues for historic preservation advocacy locally. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Brianna, who's going to talk about crafting messages to be effective in those venues.
Thanks so much, Chris. There were a lot of great gems of advice in there and great visuals. I'm also, in recent years, become quite a zoning nerd for that exact reason of what gets zoned is what gets built. And so while it's frustrating for us on the HPC of always feeling like we're saying no to things, it's because the rules aren't set up for us to rebuild our historic districts that we're trying to protect. So very important that all of us got some homework here, folks. Go home and read your zoning code and your planning documents to see if you could even rebuild the historic districts that you're trying to protect. So I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit more about messaging and knowing your community and data. I've been working for the past year as a revitalization policy analyst with Preservation Maryland, and I get to manage their smart growth program. So I am doing preservation through the back door, kind of, where we're talking about land use decisions and adaptive reuse and environmentalism and how all that, if we just reuse the places we already have, which is the major concept of smart growth, helps us reach our historic preservation goals. So one thing I wanted to harp on today was the power of community and connection. And for you all, again, there's going to be some homework coming out of this, finding out about what your community cares about, who lives in your community, and who you know that knows somebody else, and how they might be connected with preservation. I feel a lot of times in preservation advocacy, you say historic preservation, and people will come up with 8 different things about what that means to them. And instead of us getting offended that they don't know what we do on a review board, or what your local historic preservation staff does, or what your local preservation nonprofit does, it's up to us to educate people and bring their level of knowledge up so that they could be a spokesperson for us and with us. So I encourage all of you to really take that to heart and don't get offended, educate. So when it comes to local preservation, I wanted to introduce you guys to the idea of grassroots versus institutionalized power. And I think, if we all look back at how preservation started as a grassroots movement, and over time at the local, state, national, even international level, we have institutionalized preservation. So we now have HPCs, we have a national register, there's a World Heritage List. There's all these ways that we have institutionalized preservation, which is great. But it also means that we're part of the system, and that system has overlooked certain groups of people over time. So as you are advocating for more preservation in your community, you really need to be aware of who is in institutionalized positions of power and who are those grassroots advocates who might not know that they need to be on your team. I also want to talk about gatekeepers versus champions. You're going to encounter both of them. You're not going to sway all the gatekeepers. There's still some people that are going to just be against you no matter what evidence you put in front of them. And that's okay. You just need to have more champions and loud champions on your team. And also think in ways of formal institutionalized power, but also informal power. So let me get into this a little bit more. In terms of preservation, as Chris was talking about the planning documents and the zoning, I think there are 3 subjects that have been top of mind for my work recently where preservation really aligns with the plans that a lot of communities have. And that those 3 areas are housing and creating more housing options in your community. That is economic development, whether it's a downtown revitalization effort or creating more jobs in your community. Preservation helps with that. And our sustainability plans, whether your town or city is trying to go net zero carbon, or you are like Nashville and you realized a few years ago that your landfills are almost full. And what do you do about that? And how could we make that so we're saving more buildings in the process? So here's a little bit of homework for you all. Marie has put in our handouts a resource list that we came up with as we were making this presentation. And there's a couple of links on there that I'll reference here. In terms of housing, I want you all to go find out what types of housing is in your historic districts or in your older building stock in your community. because I bet you will have more types of housing than is allowed to be built today. So this graph on the far left is from Place Economics, 24 reasons why historic preservation is good for your community. And what it shows is that even in a city like LA, their historic districts have a lot more housing options of those 2 to 4 unit buildings. And what you will see with a lot of planning documents today is that communities have written their planning codes so that they can build single family detached homes, or they can do apartment units of 5 units or more. And so I want you all to go look at what already exists in your community and go look at your permit data to find out what have we been building, because what gets zoned is what gets built. And so your historic districts are protecting this class of housing that is illegal to build today. And that is important for you to point out, and why historic districts are needed, and in fact protecting housing options in your community. Second one, everyone should Google Urban 3. They're a consulting firm based in Asheville, North Carolina, but they do these great tax value per acre. So if you are looking to advocate for a downtown district, or a nearby to downtown district that it's on small lots, or you're in a community with a lot of row homes, something with a lot of density, your taxable value per acre is going to be way higher than that big box store on the outskirts of town. And being able to demonstrate that to your decision makers in graphic form could be super helpful. And the third is sustainability. This is a picture from San Antonio where they now have a deconstruction ordinance on the books. So again, a little bit of homework. Find out in your community what is being demolished. Is it single family homes? Is it older homes? Is it commercial structures? And how might you talk with your public waste officials to see how those materials could be recirculated for reuse, or maybe they don't need to come down at all and there are other options that can be had with those buildings. Another concept I want you guys to understand is the spectrum of public participation. This is from the International Association of Public Participation. And if you're in an institutionalized position of power, let's say you're this, staff to your planning commission or staff to your HPC, then you might have projects that come across your desk where you need to do public engagement. And I want you to take a close look at this spectrum of, are you just informing people? Or are you actually doing meaningful public engagement where you are sharing power, and whatever the community comes up with, you will implement? And this goes also the same for grassroots efforts. If you are trying to build a grassroots coalition to help your community, you need to be ready to make a bigger table and allow more people to share that power with you. You will get a lot further. I created this little spectrum of public preservation. But I know everyone, might start out in your community, just reusing old buildings. That's a lot of what preservation's about. Documenting your history. That's a lot of what preservation's about. And when you get to the institutionalized points of preservation, like having policy protections and design guidelines, we can't forget about the basic steps of preservation happening along this spectrum. And I really want people to understand that this is kind of a cycle, that you have to do all of these things, and probably repeatedly, to remind, if your new city council comes in, they might not know that they need to be reusing historic buildings, or that your city hall, has all this great history, and that's why they should restore the city hall. So don't forget about just the basics of reusing buildings, documenting history, sharing those stories, and that will help you build your case for the institutionalized bits when it comes down to like design guidelines and ordinances that Chris was talking about. I also wanted to point out that on one end is usually a very grassroots avenue, and the other end is a really institutionalized avenue. So when it comes to mapping your decision makers, say you want to institute a new historic district in your community, how might you go about this? Well, you need to orient yourself with these groups of people. Who are your elected officials, like your mayor, city council? Who are appointed officials? Who runs your economic development authority? Who is on your industrial review authority? Those people and those boards, if you have a land banks have a tremendous amount of power. They could be doing preservation work. You should be introducing yourselves to them and understanding how your goals can help them reach their goals. Also make friends with your city planning staff, and that could be in planning and zoning. It could be in code enforcement. It could be your public waste officials. All can be part of the preservation system. And also think about the adjacent groups that are connected with the other three groups. That might be a chamber of commerce. That could be your Rotary Club. There could be religious leaders in your community that are already know some of these people that are in institutionalized positions of power. I'll also share you should anticipate objections. You're not going to get everybody on board, and that's okay. But what you do need to do is make sure your grassroots advocates are louder than the naysayers. And that takes planning and prep. So when you're building a case for preservation, if you looked at our messaging guide, NAPC's messaging guide, which was published a few years ago, that is in the handout that I referenced earlier, there's a very similar structure to this that I have laid out on the screen. I did a TEDx talk here in Savannah last year on redlining and single family zoning. And this was the structure that I used to try to condense 100 years of history into a 10-minute talk. You have to set up the context of why should anybody care about this. You have to provide some conflict, make them feel something, provide some more details. You have to state the outcome, like what is the action you're wanting taken? And then you also have to have your concluding messaging and what happens if no action is taken. If your city council never votes for your historic district, what happens? Paint this picture for them. So I want to run through a quick win that we had recently here in Savannah that I was a part of. And this was not led by our Historic Preservation Commission, but our historic preservation advocates were at the table. And this has to do with zoning and allowing missing middle housing to be rebuilt in many areas of our city. So the first step we did was get to know the people in our community that need housing, that we are all struggling to build housing for. And as you can see from the slide on the screen, that is primarily people of color in our community. And we are a majority Black community. So already we know we need to have more engagement with folks from that community. We also, I had a friend put together great graphics to illustrate the problem of the median house for sale in Savannah is $324,000. And if you are a white head of household making more than the average income, then you still have an affordability gap of $38,000. But if you're a Black head of household, your affordability gap is $174,000. So just paint the picture. This is the pulling on the heartstrings of trying to illustrate the problem to the decision makers. Next, we had to paint a picture of what we wanted. We want to be able to rebuild these historic structures. These are duplex, a side-by-side duplex and a quad in Savannah that are not in historic districts. They're not protected in any manner. If these houses burned down, they could not be rebuilt and we would be losing housing units. So we had to show a lot of pictures and maps of where these properties were. We also had a lot of advocates. We got the Chamber of Commerce and the Tourism Board, a local group of religious leaders to step up and share their opinion and why they care about housing, that more housing and people in better housing situations closer to downtown, closer to their jobs is better for everybody. And that is economic development. So getting more people besides just the preservationist to share your message is really helpful. And then when we went to the city council meeting, we literally had a spreadsheet of groups and different people from all walks of life that were coming to speak and share their opinion as to why this mattered to them. So if you're trying to get your historic district passed, I encourage you to literally have a spreadsheet of all your advocates from different neighborhoods, different walks of life, people who are best friends with people who are in city council, people who have probably never attended a city council meeting in their life, but they have a lived experience and they can show up and share their opinion. All of those matter. It's back to the spectrum of public participation, to empower more people to share your message. We were successful in getting our affordable housing overlay district passed, so now we can rebuild missing middle housing in neighborhoods where it was previously illegal in Savannah, but it took a group effort to make this happen. I want to quickly flip through a couple of examples and then swap over to Lisa because she has a lot to share this afternoon. So that was my story of preservationists stepping up to change zoning policy in Savannah. But here are a couple examples that I want to harp on. As you're building grassroots support for historic preservation in your community, it can be a slow roll. So last week in Maryland, Preservation Maryland hosted a deconstruction summit in Baltimore. This is to build momentum for a group in Baltimore that's trying to pass a deconstruction ordinance in Baltimore. But what we did is get a lot of people from a lot of walks of life who do or should care about deconstruction in the same room to talk and problem solve together. That included a couple of elected officials, but mostly just a lot of community people who they needed to hear from. So create an environment where your elected officials start hearing things from different people. I also want to highlight social media usage. The Pines Preservation Guild does a great job in North Carolina of running their social media, and even just the back to basics preservation of sharing community assets. They have coloring pages of historic buildings in their community that they care about. Those should be circulated widely. Also, think about hosting a public forum for preservation or a candidates forum. People are running for your city council. You could host a preservation forum and ask them questions about historic preservation. That would build their knowledge that they have preservation voters in their community, and that's an issue that they need to be concerned about, same as public safety or education. In the handout is how to plan a public forum and candidates forum, so check that out. Lastly, if you are a city who is leading one of these efforts, make sure that you are also using social media and translating in different languages. This is an example from San Antonio as they were moving forward with trying to designate a new neighborhood. And they had a series of true false advertisements that went out to try to answer people's questions and get ahead of the fears. So my ingredients that I wanted to share with you is have a spreadsheet, make new friends, understand people from all walks of life in your community that would benefit from more buildings being preserved. Use your strategic data that we talked about, have an outreach plan, and all of those things together can help you reach your goals, whether that's saving more buildings in your community, saving a specific building, or passing a local historic district. And with that, I will pass it over to Lisa, who will share her story with us.
Thanks, Bree. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. I appreciate this. And I think we've got great context here. You're talking about the grassroots, and then you're talking about, in essence, the treetops with our laws that we have the opportunity to put in place to protect historic resources. I'm going to talk about that middle area. I'm going to talk about leadership at the city council level, county board of supervisors level, the place where decisions get made that we have the opportunity to impact as preservationists, but we also have the opportunity by becoming one of the members of those decision-making bodies. So some of you know me, my background. I've been in historic preservation for 30 plus years right now. Worked with the National Trust, have been a board member for NAPC, and moved back to my hometown from the DC area, Annapolis specifically, where I was chief of preservation. Moved back to Lodi, California, an agricultural community, about 8 years ago now. And when I came back, one of the things I realized was people talked about our historic downtown. I thought, great, while I've been gone, they've created a historic district. No, they just referred to it as the historic downtown. So sure enough, we had 3 buildings listed on the National Register, and I'll show those in a bit. But the point of that was I came back and I saw my old high school had lost a number of buildings being reused, and I'll talk about that, but still a lot of historic properties lost. Downtown, our oldest buildings on Sacramento Street were also threatened. So I was at the point in my life and career that I thought, what the heck? I worked with a number of governments over the years. Why not run for the city council? Sought out who was currently the gentleman that was serving as the mayor. It rotates in our city. That's something I'll talk about next in the next slide. But then really started an aggressive campaign based on what the community needs were. Bree talked about that, understanding what your community values. So my community was really concerned about public safety. Homelessness was at its peak when I arrived back. The downtown was being taken over, in essence, by tent cities. And so it was really a view of concerns for public safety that my community expressed to me as I did my walk around to neighborhoods. So I did what you do as an elected or a candidate for an elected position. I got the endorsement of the firefighters and the police officers. You have to start somewhere, and that somewhere is likely not going to be historic preservation. But I'll come around to why that's important to understand all the issues in the community. So the first thing you have to know, as Bree said, look up your zoning ordinance, know what is already in place, what you can and can't do. And as Chris alluded to, you have to be part of the process when your general plan or your comprehensive plan comes up for updating or renewal. It's really important to be part of that process. But to better understand, the form of government is essential. There are a number of form of governments. The top 3 are more typical. You'll find in New England states, the town meeting is obviously used quite a bit. Having worked in Massachusetts and specifically Nantucket, that town meeting is a critical citizens-driven approach, which is a great opportunity in those communities. But in a mayor-council form of government, you can have a strong mayor or you can have a weak mayor. And a strong mayor, which we had in Annapolis when I lived there, has the ability to has his own staff, can actually manage and introduce legislation. In Annapolis, the mayor served as the chair of the council, but in other places, the mayor or the chief executive may not serve on the council. One of our cities, which is a charter city, does not have the mayor serve on the council. The council is a legislative body in that particular instance. If you have a weak form of mayor council, in essence, all 5 members of the council are the decision-making body, not the mayor. So too often I would find preservationists going in and talking to the mayor when in all reality, in the weaker form of mayor-council relationships, the only thing the mayor really does is sign proclamations, announce them, is the spokesperson at ribbon cutting events or on behalf of the city, and may help with setting the agenda in some way. But every council member has the ability to agendize an item, and that's crucial to understand. So make sure you touch base with all your council members. Now, in the council manager form of government, truly your city manager or your city administrator is the CEO. The council will set the policies, but beyond that, the council has little and should have little control over how the CEO administers and implements those policies. What the council can do is through the budget process or through the constituent process, move forward ideas for new initiatives, for programs and services, can certainly address financing a project or not financing a project through the budget process. So the council still has quite a bit of policy power. The manager serves at the will of the council. So again, council as a whole, not the mayor. Commissions or boards, I want to talk about that appointee process. I think Chris made a really good point about good architects. One of the best opportunities you have as an elected official is to find good, solid preservationists, people who may be architects, people who may be historians, and get them to serve on various commissions. So the council and the mayor have that ability to appoint individuals to commissions, not just the review board or the architectural review board, but the planning commission, the economic development commission, even the arts commission. There's so many opportunities to have a preservation voice in those commissions. And truly, that is the place that many individuals decide they want to run for city council or a county board of supervisors. So it's a good training ground, and I would advocate that people consider who is a good person out there that can represent our preservation story and get them to serve on a city commission or council. Town meeting and representative town meeting is something a little more unique, as I said before. Show up and give your point of view, and that's how things get decided at town and representative town meetings. So the role of the city council, as I said, it's fairly limited. This was my first strategic planning meeting with our city council. I walked into the city of Lodi. They had not updated their strategic plan since 2007. And so it was time for an update. And that was something I was glad to be able to get our city manager to move forward. So that was probably one of my initial successes at serving on the council. But again, you use that process to set the city's vision, to establish policies and committees. We actually, through that process, established an economic development department. We later were able to hire a full-time economic development manager. We've now increased that to 1.5 positions, and we now have budgeted for an economic development plan. What is so important about that is Main Street. That is where we put our Main Street program. And so it was really essential to have the tool there, to have the mechanism to begin the discussion about historic preservation. And at the same time, we also, through that process, identified the goal of downtown revitalization. That led to establishing a downtown specific plan process. Chris talked about the importance of planning. It's essential. That's where preservation finds its hook. So not only do we have an economic development plan underway, we have a downtown specific plan underway. And as a council member, with the support of my Chamber of Commerce, which I also serve on, we were able to get a historic resource survey incorporated into that downtown planning process. So I can't emphasize more how important getting preservation into those plans through your key decision makers, where, as Bree said, it's your allies, it's your Chamber of Commerce, it's your Merchants Association, it's individual property owners who have invested in the rehabilitation of their buildings. I mentioned previously hiring and managing your appointees, which are the committee members. And then the last two, again, really, it's about the rubber meets the road when your city finances are being reviewed for their annual budget update. That's where you have the opportunity to encourage expenditures for things such as survey, for rehabilitation of buildings, for microloan programs, for the rehabilitation of buildings. This happens to be something that I had tracked a long time ago, and it's so true now as an elected official. We spend about 35% of our time really providing services for individuals. I get dozens of emails, phone calls every single week about problems, complaints. And yes, it is filling the potholes. It truly is. I didn't really think that was a thing until I became an elected official. They want their streets taken care of. They want their buildings to be safe. They want to ensure that there is a higher quality of life and that their experience of their community is a good one, not just for themselves, but for their visitors. This happens to be a gentleman. We have a name for him. He's the mayor, the unofficial mayor of Pine Street. And we have a little landmark location. For those of you who know of A&W Root Beer, it was begun by a businessman in Lodi, California. And this location on Main Street marks his first little shack that he put up to sell root beer. And it's had a bronze plaque for a number of years. Joe, our Pine Street mayor, couldn't get the city to clean the bronze plaque, and he finally just did it himself. So this is something, we have probably a dozen bronze plaques in downtown commemorating buildings still standing or sites where history was made in our city. So that phone call to me was about the fact that he had a complaint. Public Works wasn't doing what he had asked. Public Works will now be taking care of all of the plaques in the downtown because of his phone call to me. Along those same lines, the National League of Cities actually did every year through the State of the Cities analysis that they do for various communities around the country. They really look, what are the key priorities of elected officials, specifically what is the mayor talking about in the state of the city? And they also measure that against what they see in terms of citizen priorities. I think what's really interesting to see over the years, public safety has often been number one or two. What we saw in 2025 was economic development was top of the list. Infrastructure, which has always been high, that's your streets, that's your sewers, that is wastewater systems, stormwater systems, electrical utilities. That came in second. And then housing was third. Housing has actually increased on the list. It used to be about fifth or so. It is now third. And as Bree indicated, it really is that middle housing. Affordable housing is an issue. Certainly in California, it's one of the biggest issues that we see in every community. It doesn't matter if you're a major urban center or a small town. Some type of affordable housing, and I have an architect who likes to use the term affordable by design. I live in a community, when you talk about affordable housing, people have this impression that you're only talking about Section 8 housing. So we have to talk about the affordability of housing and the way it's designed, and that does resonate with individuals. But economic development is top of the list, and business attraction, revitalization, workforce development are essential. And I think that that's something that we as preservationists need to understand and build upon, because it really is, as we've seen so many years from the study.
I think we lost Lisa. We still have her slides. I'll give Marie a second there to hopefully bring her back online. In the meantime, I wanted to go ahead and answer a question, one that has come up that got upvoted a lot. Chris, if you're there, awesome. The question was, how can we best alleviate fears of undue government bureaucracy and control as a result of embracing historic guidelines?
Oh, I'd love to answer that question. And I also really want to acknowledge some of the great comments about comprehensive plans that have been put up in the chats and about the distinction of exactly what they do and how they're different from your actual zoning ordinance, but still very important. So I think there's some great contributions made by folks in the chat to help tease out those distinctions. But in regards to how to make community decision makers more comfortable with some of these restrictions, the most important thing in my mind to remember is that your community should have their own specifically tailored historic preservation regulations, and it should be a community-driven decision that everyone has a say in. It might be something, a situation where what's right for one town or community in your state is not right for yours because people don't want that level of regulation. And my answer to that kind of question is always, well, make it what you want it to be. Whatever your community is willing to accept. Something is better than nothing. When you see the positive impacts of having some guidelines, some regulation in place, then we can go from there. But it should never be oppressive or overreaching, because it should be born of your community's values, interests, and their tolerance level for those kinds of things.
Thank you, Chris. That was great. Marie, any update on getting Lisa back?
She is working on it.
Okay. We'll keep doing questions until she can pop back on. One question I saw that got upvoted a lot was also around funding. And I think Lisa was in the process of explaining that your local budgeting process is a great time to sneak some preservation funds in there. And as we are waiting to see how the federal budget shakes out, which will have implications on state budgets, the same process goes of you need to be at the table and make yourself aware of when of those budgeting decisions are happening. And a lot of that can also be forming relationships with the staff who might be making those budgets, and just understanding, how they might feel about adding in a new line item for something and getting those folks on board. So it's not an easy process, but it can be done.
Yeah, that's great information. And I think it's also helpful to come to those decision makers sometimes with your own ideas. And depending on what state you live in and what the state laws are, there are a lot of instruments out there like TIFs, tax increment finance districts, or BIDs, business improvement districts, that can help support redevelopment authorities or community land trusts that have historic preservation focuses within their missions. So, research what is available in your state in terms of ways to generate new revenue for your community, and go, if you can identify those opportunities, it's great to go asking for money while also presenting ways to raise money in your community at the same time.
The next question that got a lot of upvotes was strategies for assisting when owners are uncooperative, and kind of demolition by neglect situation, and just what recourse can be taken other than just issuing a citation.
So this is an area of law that I really specialize in, demolition by neglect. And there are a lot of different ways that you can solve this problem. And again, it comes down to what's the right solution for your community and what is your community's political tolerance for some of these solutions. In many cases, buildings suffering from demolition by neglect are already violating your building codes and can be qualified as unsafe buildings or structures. And your building code enforcement officer has a duty to go and put tarps over leaky roofs, stabilize walls that are collapsing, and place liens on that property for the cost of the work that they do. That enforcement authority already exists within your building codes. One helpful provision that I've encountered is providing a referral pathway for historic preservation commissions to identify properties suffering from demolition by neglect to the city council and to the building code enforcement official directly and say, look, you need to go and save this place. Another way to deal with this problem, and actually a more common way, is the development of a specific demolition by neglect ordinance. And a lot of communities have gone and explicitly written into their ordinances definitions of what constitutes demolition by neglect, what kinds of actions will be taken. And what's incredibly important about any solutions like this is that they actually have teeth. If you're going to have an ordinance that identifies something as a vacant and abandoned building, and you're going to, put fines for the owner as part of the ordinance, make sure that they're something that will actually cause the owner to do something, that they're of sufficient monetary value to create that change. A $500 annual fine is not going to make someone fix up their building that's suffering from demolition by neglect. So this is something where there are a lot of different ways that you can address this problem, from being very aggressive to more diplomatic. One of the recent examples that I saw of a good ordinance had sort of a 1-year waiting period from the moment that something was declared demolition by neglect to when financial penalties kicks in, to allow the city time to negotiate with the building owner and work with them. This is something that I'm sure if you contact your state historic preservation office, they probably have examples of ordinances and approaches that have worked in your state that comply with state law. And it's a huge problem nationwide. You're not alone if you're dealing with it. And it's something that is very difficult and emotionally difficult in many cases, and interpersonally a difficult thing to deal with some of these building owners, but it's worth doing it for the sake of the buildings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good answer, Chris. I think Lisa's still not able to jump back on. I think she's having Wi-Fi issues. So we're going to jump to our case studies, Chris. So I think Marie is going to pull that slideshow back up. And we will take a pause on Q&A, jump back to case studies, and then get to the rest of your questions. But we had more content to share with you all. So Chris, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to share with you 2 case studies that kind of come with 2 different messages about the importance of local preservation advocacy. And both of them are places that were listed on the National Trust 11 Most Endangered Historic Places in America list. One of them was listed twice, not that this one, Minidoka. Actually, gosh, now that I think about it, both of them were listed twice. But we're going to start with the Lava Ridge Wind Farm case study, which concerns Minidoka National Monument in Jerome, Idaho. And it was most recently listed on our 11 Most Endangered Places list in 2022. So Minidoka National Monument today is operated by the National Park Service. And from 1942 to 1945, it was known as the Minidoka War Relocation Camp. And over 13,000 Japanese American citizens were forcibly removed from their homes in Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and California during World War II and sent to this camp in the middle of absolutely nowhere in Idaho. And I know that our Japanese American partners in advocacy refer to this site as a concentration camp and are very committed to it being understood at that level of horror as to what happened here. So the immediate threat that we dealt with, and the case study I'd like to present, has to do with the Lava Ridge Wind Farm that was proposed there. Now, again, this is an extremely remote area. It's outside of Twin Falls, Idaho, is the next closest town. And what was proposed for the Lava Ridge Wind Farm was over 400 wind turbines, up to 740 feet tall, with new substations, operational facilities, and additional infrastructure. And if you look at the map here, all of the blue marks are strands. They're called strands or lines of wind turbines. The black hatched area is the original footprint of the Minidoka War Relocation Camp. The red star is the current national monument that's operated by the National Park Service. And as you can see, the original proposal for this massive wind farm included strands of turbines that would have been built on the footprint of the War Relocation Camp, something that our Japanese American partners described as a desecration, something that's highly offensive given the solemn nature of this site and what happened here. So the Bureau of Land Management was the federal permitting agency for this project. and they were approached to evaluate it, and they conducted a joint Section 106 and NEPA consultation that the National Trust participated in, along with representatives from the Japanese American community, who are highly effective advocates, but also the local community. No one in Jerome, Idaho really seemed to want this thing to be built, and all of the local politicians, landowners, everyone really rallied together in opposition to this project. Again, just to underscore how massive these 740-foot turbines is, here is a wonderful graphic put together by Friends of Minidoka, a group that operates a pilgrimage for Japanese American survivors of Minidoka and their descendants every year. It was a key advocacy partner for us. But you can see the tiny little guard tower for Minidoka there on the bottom left, and these wind turbines that would have been taller than the Washington Monument and the Space Needle, and with blades as long as a 747. It really, especially given its close proximity to the National Monument, would have overwhelmed the site. And the feeling of isolation, the complete emptiness, speaks to the integrity of the setting and what was experienced by the folks who were relocated here. So it really would have permanently changed the experience of visiting Minidoka, and really, would have, in my mind, really dishonored the memory of everyone who suffered there. So this is a story about what we consider to be a NEPA Section 106 success. After 2 years of advocacy with the BLM, we got the BLM to require the project to go from what's depicted on the left, which was one of the NEPA alternatives presented, to what's depicted on the right. And the red star is Minidoka National Monument. So you can see it dramatically removed the impact from Minidoka. Overall, the BLM required the project footprint to be shrunk from 84,000 acres down to 44,000. The maximum turbine height was limited to 660 feet instead of 740, and the total number of turbines was reduced from 400 down to 241. So these are huge reductions in the scale of the project that were achieved through advocacy, through the Section 106 and NEPA process by the National Trust, by our partners in the Japanese American community, and also local advocates. And we really felt like this was what 106 is supposed to do, what NEPA is supposed to do to reduce project footprints, to avoid, minimize, and mitigate adverse effects. But as I explained at the start of this presentation, federal law is relatively limited. It's just a process, right? And we affected the process. The process was effective, and we were able to change this project for the better. But it pales in comparison to the power of local advocacy. Because what happened next in the story of Lava Ridge, after this review process was completed and the record of decision for the project was issued with the smaller footprint, was the local advocates really kicked into high gear. And local advocates managed to get first to the Idaho State Legislature, who issued pronouncements, or I think it was a proclamation, against Lava Ridge, and saying they didn't want the project to happen at all. The Idaho governor stepped in and said, we don't think that this project should happen at all. He actually instructed the Idaho Attorney General's office to challenge it legally, which they did, actually challenging the FAA's non-approval, the way the project would have affected flight paths for agricultural activities in the area. And they were gearing up for more legal challenges if necessary. But crucially, local advocates were able to get to Idaho's congressional delegation, as well as the Japanese American community, who again was pivotal in advocacy here. But it was Senator Mike Crapo, Senator James Rich, and Representative Mike Simpson and Representative Ross Fulcher, who really took the baton from their local constituents and said, we need to kill this project and make this not happen. And then on January 20th of this year, one of Donald Trump's day one executive orders concerning wind contained this provision that specifically mentions Lava Ridge Wind Project and pauses it from moving forward, and essentially instructs the secretary to review all the compliance documents that had previously occurred, the ROD. Now, this was a case where we kind of had strange bedfellows in historic preservation and people that are just against wind farms, don't believe in climate change. That's not the National Trust position. But we were advocating for the same thing in this case, that this wind project should go somewhere else, that in our, concern, it was just going to affect historic resources and highly nationally significant historic resources too severely. But what this really shows too is that you can only get so far with Section 106 and NEPA. And even when you have a success story from Section 106 and NEPA, the power of local advocacy, getting to your politicians and decision makers, running this up the chain. And I'll tell you, these representatives, these senators, they'll listen to the National Trust and other groups, but who they really want to hear from are their constituents, their voters, their donors, people that matter to them and their future. And that's what happened in this case, was that power of local advocacy ultimately, as of right now, has killed this project. So never underestimate the power, and always remember the limitations of the federal review processes. Now, the other case study that I'm going to share is, again, as I mentioned, about a site that was listed on the National Trust 11 Most Endangered Places list, not once but twice. And this is Union Pier in Charleston, South Carolina. And this is a story about perseverance and about the importance of communities not giving up the fight and making sure that they keep on going and insist on what's right for their community when it comes to new development. This is a debacle that really began in the late 2000s. So, coming up on almost 20 years ago now that some of this started happening. So the original Union Pier controversy 1.0 had to do with cruise ships. There is a major, or was a major, cruise terminal located directly adjacent to Charleston's National Historic Landmark District downtown. And it was a port of embarkation, debarkation, meaning that people would come to Charleston, park their cars, get on the ship, and then leave. It was not a port of call. And back in the late 2000s, a permit application appeared. It was the State Ports Authority applying for a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers to drive piles into the river. That's all it said, was drive piles into the river. And as the Army Corps of Engineers did their Section 106 evaluation for the project, they insisted on only considering the driving of the piles and the fence line of the project. Well, the reality is that the piles were going to be driven to enable the drastic expansion of the cruise terminal here, to facilitate the exponential increase of cruise traffic in Charleston. And one of the big arguments that the community had to have was, look, this driving these piles is one thing, but what the piles are going to enable, the larger picture of what this is going to do to our community, is a much bigger deal. And the Army Corps of Engineers refused to consider the full impacts of the project. And what ultimately happened in the first round of this controversy over Union Pier was the Coastal Conservation League and the Preservation Society of Charleston, two fantastic organizations, had to go to court. And the National Trust participated as an amicus, a friend of the court, in this litigation, and went all the way to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, Federal Fourth Circuit. And ultimately, Judge Richard Gergel ordered in 2013 that the Army Corps of Engineers had to go back and redo their Section 106 review process and actually take into account the effects that increased cruise tourism would have on the Charleston Historic District. And, the effects are numerous. I think you can see from the image on the last slide just how out of scale, and this one, just how out of scale these giant cruise ships are compared to Charleston's small scale historic built environment. There's also the issue of the concentrated intrusion of thousands of cruise passengers in one area of the city, and how that overwhelms not only city infrastructure, but also creates almost a sense of inauthenticity. When you have more tourists on a peninsula than you do permanent residents, I've heard it called the Venice effect, where you lose the authenticity of a place. So all of those considerations, thanks to the Preservation Society and the Coastal Conservation League pursuing this lawsuit, the 106 having to be redone, all of those other impacts had to be considered. And this was, a victory, a huge victory for preservation, and a huge victory for the Charleston preservation community to stop that cruise terminal expansion and to force the reconsideration, more holistic reconsideration of impacts. So as those impacts were being considered, the owner of the property, the State Ports Authority, quickly came to the conclusion, well, gosh, if we have to do all this all over again and think about all these things, we're just really not going to be able to expand cruise operations here. So they pivoted to what has now become Union Pier Controversy 2.0. And just last year, Union Pier was listed on our 11 most endangered places list because of this proposed project. So essentially, the State Ports Authority wanted to turn over the land, which is roughly 65, a little bit more acres, one of the very large prime undeveloped piece of real estate on the whole East Coast, over to a developer who proposed this redevelopment plan. And of course, as with all redevelopment plans proposed by major developers, you're going to get beautiful watercolors that show you how this magnificent place is going to, completely uplift your city, and it's going to be the greatest thing ever. And, when you look at this image on the screen, maybe you can see this as a beautiful place and see what their vision was. But again, the local preservation community rose to action. These are images, GIS images that were done by the Preservation Society of Charleston, just showing how out of scale this dense new development on Union Pier would have been in comparison to the historic neighborhood of Ansonboro directly adjacent to it, and really the rest of historic Charleston. And, over time, as this proposal was being rolled out, the Preservation Society and other groups like Historic Charleston Foundation really were able to advocate to the city and convince them that this was not the right project for Charleston. This was not the right use for Union Pier. And ultimately, the State Ports Authority just, very recently consummated a sale to a private developer. A redevelopment of the area is being considered, but it's being completely reimagined to be more compatible with the historic district scale. And this is a story of a community looking at this big piece of land and for almost 20 years now, insisting that whatever development be built there be done correctly, and not giving up and not backing down, having to go to court in the first time, and in the second time working very closely, influencing the city to ensure the right outcome for the community. So the lesson here is, these things can take a lot of time, especially when you're talking about big land deals, lots and lots of money. They can take forever, but you can never give up. And if you keep up the fight, you can get to the outcome that you're working for.
Thank you, Chris. Those are awesome stories and shows us that even preservation can get to the White House if we push hard enough sometimes. I believe Lisa is online, and I wanted to shift to her case study on her downtown. Oh, still no Lisa. Crap. Well, in the handout section, if you guys click on that, we have Lisa's slides there, and they are chock full of great information. So I encourage all of you to go download those and click through. She is the mayor of Lodi, California, her hometown. If you missed that, she, moved back there and ran for mayor. So I know part of her ending message was, why not have more preservation mayors? Why not you run for city council? Why not you get appointed to one of the commissions? Really use that to your advantage. And we see that in state governments. We see that in Congress. So preservationists can be elected officials as well. So don't forget about that. I want to also jump back to our Q&A. One question that I think we should answer was about how HPC could ask for support from community members. Chris, do you have ideas of, like, if you were city HPO and you need grassroots advocates to say X because you as a public official can't say it, how would you go about that relationship?
So I think it's very important for neighborhood associations and local historic preservation organizations to maintain open lines of communication with city HPOs, and to make sure that they feel comfortable at least privately expressing their concerns and viewpoints. It's also really important to protect your city staff. Don't throw them under the bus. Don't out them. Don't do those things. you can work together in a way that doesn't get HPOs in trouble, and you can help them get their message out if there's trust, if there's a good working relationship there. And that's a two-way street. You have to respect city employees and treat them well to build the kind of relationships where they will tell you things that the public should really know. And it's a very difficult position to be city staff, sitting on that kind of knowledge. And it's so important to have these ongoing relationships with them to help have that public interface with city officials.
That's a great answer. And I agree, as I typically sit on the other side of it, where I'm the grassroots advocate who's looking to make talking points, looking to reach out to my elected officials. And so I'm reaching out to our staff members to ask about the process and what can I say? And what have they been saying that I need to articulate in a slightly different way to help triangulate the message? So definitely work closely, grassroots advocates, neighborhood associations, merchants associations, even local YIMBY chapters, the Yes in My Backyard. The historic preservation advocates are on the leadership team of that group here in Savannah. And we're working on getting a Yes in God's Backyard chapter started to help expand the table of people who care about historic preservation and housing. So whatever issue you are trying to push in your community, Chris has shared some great stories of how having multiple voices at the table and being patient can really go a long way. I want to shift to our ending message now because we're almost out of time here. So Marie, if you can pull up that slide.
Yes, just 1 second here.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. Please take a moment to download the handout so you can review all the great information we put in the resource list for you. Our call to action for you is to identify one decision maker in your community that you can reach out to have a coffee with in the next month. It could be a member of your city council, that could be a mayor, could be chair of the planning commission, could be chair of the historic preservation commission if you're a grassroots advocate. But get yourself in front of one of your elected officials who are in positions of power and talk preservation. Educate them about what your concerns are and how you're not the only person in town having those concerns, and start building those relationships as Chris was talking about. And also, as election season comes along, think about who in your community is a preservation advocate who could be running for office. That would be very important. So that's part of your homework. And I think our final slide here is an advertisement for the NAPC virtual summer short course. This would also be great for you to suggest that elected official attend the NAPC summer short course, because it's all virtual, easy for them to sit in on. I believe it's also, it's on demand or watch now. This will be a 2-day short course starting Monday, June 2nd. And it's fast-paced, easy to digest information, and there'll be speakers from across the country. So whether you're a brand new volunteer or a seasoned preservation professional, we promise that you'll get practical insight and inspiration from the lots of topics that will be covered. So please sign up for that or send it to someone who should sign up for it. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great day. Thank you, Chris, so much for participating.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.